Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back. Black.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Anthony Neal. We're here at the John Hope Franklin Center. Our guest today is Professor GerShun Avilez, Associate Professor in the Department of English and Comparative Literature and Director of the Program in Sexuality Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's the author of Radical Aesthetics and Modern Black Nationalism, published by the University of Illinois Press, in the New Black Studies series, edited by Dame Darlene Clark Hine and Dwight McBride. How are you doing today, GerShun?
I'm doing really well. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us here at Left to Black. Your book is timely in the way that, of course, it's reimagining Black nationalism in this moment of kind of heightened political activity, you know, whether we're talking here in North Carolina or nationally. You begin the book with an interesting conversation. You bring Larry Neal and Marlon Riggs in conversation with each other. For a moment, talk to our audience, for those folks who don't know who either of these two really important figures are, and how significant it is to actually bring them in the same space to have a conversation, essentially.
Sure. Well, Larry Neal is an important figure of the Black Arts Movement, one of the signature kind of creators of the Black aesthetic and the Black Arts Movement. So someone who has become a touchstone for talking about 1960s, 1970s African-American artistic production. Just really hugely informative and influential. On the other hand, we have this Black gay filmmaker, Marlon Riggs, from the 80s and 90s, who is much more connected with kind of critiquing limiting ideas about Blackness. And we often think about the Black Arts Movement as being important, but sometimes having constricting ideas about Blackness or kind of sexuality or gender. Right. Yeah, so part of the reason I bring these two together because it's an unexpected move. I even say that in the book, that we wouldn't expect to have these two in conversation, but I think part of what we've got to get better at is understanding how people from different camps actually might be in conversation and might not be totally against each other or trying to define themselves against each other.
There's a way in which your book takes up Marlon Riggs' last project. When you watch Black Is, Black Ain't, right? This is a film, of course, that he's doing as he's dying. And he, you know, it's in the midst of the '92 riots. Right. And so all of this imagery is being brought in, and he himself seems to be contemplating the idea of Black nationalism. There's a way in which your book, I think, picks up that project to have the fullness of that conversation. Of course, Riggs wasn't around long enough to fully examine.
No, I think for much of Riggs's work is really thinking about the value of Black nationalism. I mean, he was never afraid to kind of criticize homophobia or sexism, but he also found out, and I think this is true of a lot of Black gay and lesbian artists, they understand the kind of value it has to African-American populations in this country, why they might be invested in it, but also as both a political and artistic side of excitement for the return to Black nationalism. So I think Riggs, part of what he's doing is trying to figure out, kind of mine it for what's valuable there, and not simply cast the baby out with the bathwater. And I see, because there might be some strange sexism, we can't talk about it. He wants to try to figure out how to use it and make it valuable.
One of the things that you mentioned that's really the activity of the book, this idea of queering Black nationalism. Right. Writing, queer Black bodies into that tradition, and thinking about the ways that Black nationalism as an arts practice, as an aesthetic practice, is really pushing towards some experimental forms that are even more organically in conversation with what we might think about as Black queer artists. Right. I think about the work of, say, someone like Baraka, and it's really experimental theater from the 1960s. You know, stuff that folks don't take up a whole lot now when they think about his legacy. One of the people that you invoke in this, of course, is Roderick Ferguson. Yes. And queer color critique. What did it mean to bring that in conversation with more traditional Black nationalist rhetoric?
So the Ferguson was just incredibly helpful to me when I first read it when I was in grad school, and that book kind of never left me, and it kind of always kept me thinking. But I think what it gave to me was, one, the sense of trying to think about positionality, like what it means to think from the perspective of the queer of color person, how they might interact with the social world. But maybe more importantly, I take from his book this notion that sexual minorities, racial minorities don't simply reject kind of dominant ideologies, don't simply cast them away. They find ways to negotiate them. I think that's why the book was important. I think that became how I thought about this, because my real question is, how do women and sexual minorities or any kind of dissenter, do they deal with Black nationalism? Do they just reject it? Or is there another way to understand that engagement with this kind of really dominant ideology? So I think that, I mean, it's kind of also unexpected that it's really, I got that way of thinking from Ferguson's work to help me think about how we might better understand how an individual, especially a marginalized individual, might relate to a kind of a dominant and sometimes stultifying or paralyzing ideology.
I mean, one of the things you suggest that, in fact, bringing these forces in conversation with each other, it actually expands the archive of what we understand as Black nationalist art, if you will, or the art of the Black aesthetic from the 1960s, but also expands our notions of Black nationalism. I think if you think about it from the standpoint of contemporary artists, it allows more of a way, and you can respond to this, more of a way for contemporary Black artists who might be queer to see themselves in the context of this tradition in ways that perhaps Baldwin, couldn't see himself in that tradition, at least as he fully expressed his sexuality, or could, or chose not to fully express his sexuality.
No, I mean, in some ways, my first question in the book is really, what is the legacy of the Black arts movement? Like, where is it? And I think we answer that question initially, we have a sense of one legacy, but I'm of the opinion that when we look to contemporary Black and lesbian artists, that's actually one of its legacies. I mean, in some ways, some of the questions they're posing and ways of thinking about the body and sex that African Americans are still dealing with, and so are Black queer artists. And I think that is where, I don't know if I'm ruffling feathers, but I'm really trying to push us to think differently about the relationship between the present and the past, and looking to Black queer art to be one way of understanding where Black nationalism is now.
And you're clear to make a distinction between what might be thought of as more traditional Black nationalism and the Black nationalism of this modern movement, right? So, to kind of separate it from Martin Delany in the earliest moments. And even Garvey, in the 1920s. So you do mention, the whole regalia of Garveyism, actually touches on what is possible aesthetically.
Exactly. This idea of having a quite revolutionary dress and way how you carry yourself, and is a part of this conversation that's part of Black nationalism from its earliest time to now, redefining what Blackness means in the public. Like that is
the
part
pageantry
of it. The pageantry, precisely. But for me, there's something else at stake in kind of modern Black nationalism, late 20th century Black nationalism. There's a relationship to the past, but there's something different going on when you get to the later part of the 20th century.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor GerShun Avilez, who is Associate Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. No shade. He's the author of Radical Aesthetics and Modern Black Nationalism. One of the ways I like the way that you talk about, Black nationalism is, to put it in these two tensions, closing ranks and revolutionizing minds, right? And in some ways, when you think about, the whole kind of Hotep moment, if you will, on Twitter or Facebook, social media, I mean, it still is that kind of idea. How do we create a context to close ranks? And how do we revolutionize Black minds? But you also talk about the fact that there's some anxieties that are associated with that.
Absolutely.
This idea of white innocence, the importance of Black kinship, but of course, issues of reproduction and sex. Talk a little bit about those anxieties and the way that you unpack them in the context of the book.
Sure, okay, I'll try to do that as briefly as I can. No, well, I found that there were certain kind of pressure points in terms of 1960s and Black nationalist rhetoric. And for me, these were the dominant pressure points, meaning the points around which there's lots of anxiety, lots of frustration, lots of energy in terms of political organizing. So ideas about Black kinship, and there's so many kinship metaphors, this idea of brotherhood and sisterhood that are really giving the language for Black nationalism. So that was one thing. Whiteness, there's so much anxiety around whiteness, precisely because, and it continues to be, right? This sense of so much about a Black identity isn't just about Blackness being different from whiteness, but also the social role is constructed around kind of white privilege. And so dealing with Blackness sometimes also means having to kind of deconstruct or deal with whiteness also, even though that's sometimes precisely seen as the problematic empowered idea that's there. So I felt like I needed to talk about whiteness Mostly because during the reading of the period, it's just everywhere. They're always talking about whiteness, but not necessarily in simplistic ways, and in multiple ways. So I really wanted to unpack what whiteness meant at that time period and how it continues to be really important.
I mean, actually, really revolutionary ways in the 1960s, because who's publicly actually unpacking and deconstructing whiteness? I mean, the power of someone like Malcolm X was that he offered a kind of public critique of white supremacy that we very rarely heard publicly. And it really, empowered artists to think about deconstructing that on both, broad levels and also very specific kind of micro levels.
Absolutely, and that's why I was less interested in just talking about whiteness as just simply power, but there is a particular rhetoric around white innocence, that this idea that whites are somehow always already innocent, meaning the slavery and these kind of problems are from the past, so that distance from the past means that people in the present don't have to deal with them. No one thinks of themselves as being racist themselves, like they're innocent of racism. So there's what I found wasn't just kind of a critique of whiteness, but really the attempt to undermine the notion that whiteness means innocent. Yeah. Which gets into all kinds of really fascinating kind of legal discussions, because that's innocent, right, has a legal idea, the idea of not being guilty. And the black is already guilty.
And then those other anxieties, right? How do we reproduce the race?
Oh, and absolutely.
And who are we having sex with, right?
Exactly. That's more part of the book is about the body itself. And the reproduction is perhaps one of the most controversial issues in this time period, in part because of the anxieties around the birth control pill in this time period, but also this real desire to have like this kind of a national army, like reproduce children and have like the ranks. Then I think that's not to make light of it, but the sense that there's a need to protect, because there's a sense that black communities are in peril. Right, and being attacked. So families become really, really important.
White birth control is a conspiracy.
Precisely, right? And all these anxieties meaning that for some people, it's really about this idea of creating the community, but for others, it's a real point of anxiety because it's precisely in their reproduction that blacks are kind of in peril, like because of birth control pill. But then, of course, also, what sex has to do with it. And there's a lot of very sexually explicit stuff that comes out in the 60s. Of course, following second wave feminism and the sexual revolution, we see a lot more frank discussions of sexuality in the country, writ large. There's lots of it's happening.
Cecil Brown's work. Right?
Precisely, and Cecil Brown, there's lots of just having lots of sex. It's part of what happens. So, but instead of simply pointing out this high recurrence of sex, I find that lots of artists are interested in excavating how the black body is always sexualized and surrounded by these sexual mythologies. And they really want to take that on, so they kind of inhabit these mythologies in order to undermine them, in order to rethink them. And so in other words, to free the black body of them, they first have to kind of dig in and show us those stereotypes, show us those mythologies.
How would you unpack some of the things of this moment, given what you lay out in the book? When you think about House Bill 2 here in North Carolina, when you think about the Kaepernick protests, I was struck. I'm reading one of our colleagues, Kevin Quashie's book on Quiet, and he begins the book with Tommy Smith and John Carlos. He obviously couldn't anticipate the way that moment would be recentered in our contemporary political moment. So we're seeing, nascent strains of 21st century black nationalism in this particular moment in Black Lives Matter. But it's also very different, right? There is an absolute visible presence of black queer bodies.
Right, precisely.
Absolute visible presence of black gendered bodies, right? Women bodies, trans bodies, and what have you. In some ways, that's very revolutionary. Do you think you could trace some of this moment to some of the interventions that might have been made by artists, over the last 50 years in terms of rethinking black nationalism?
That's a fantastic question. I would say, first, it's this new world that we're seeing, in some ways, I think is made possible precisely by those artists and activists from the 70s and 80s who were critiquing black nationalism, but not discarding it. So I would say, even thinking of like what the Come By Here River Collective is doing, what the writers of Homegirls do, what artists like the Black Gay Men in other countries, what they're doing, that their avowed dedication to political radicalism, while they're still kind of talking about issues of gender sexuality. I think they are the kind of cultural lineage for what we're seeing happening now. Albeit, what they've helped us to realize is we can't talk about radicalism now the way we used to. The framework has changed, but that change for me really is a reflection of or inheritance of the kind of work done in the 80s and 90s, 70s and 90s, like that. So that's, in other words, the Black nationalist rhetoric of the 60s and 70s gets kind of reconfigured over time in the 80s. And I think what we're seeing giving birth to now is actually a direct result of the sometimes unnoticed work that's done over time in the past few decades. Yeah. That's one way. I mean, it's a really hard question, Mark, but I think that's how I would begin to understand it, because I think what you're pointing to is there is actually a lineage, and I hope my work helps us to better understand that, how we can move from something like more recognizable Black art stuff, but then understand how in the 21st century we might get a movement like Black Lives Matter that is a movement that is interested in what's happening on the ground, but also invested in the world, the cultural world, and the artistic world as well.
Have you been surprised by the way that Baldwin has suddenly become has been recentered in our conversations about race? You know, part of it, of course, is Ta-Nehisi's work, but even before Ta-Nehisi, I mean, suddenly Baldwin is all over the place.
He's everywhere. He's everywhere.
Have you been surprised at all by that?
I have not so much been surprised by it. I think Baldwin is just an artist for whom people are always discovering, and there's always more to discover because he's so, I mean, his novels are great, but I more prefer his essays, and I think it's really, as we continue to read those essays, it's amazing to pick up a volume and realize how much it resonates with the present, and I think it's his sense of having his finger on the pulse of his contemporary moment, his own moment, that resonates with our own, that gives him a kind of timelessness. So I think that it's not as surprising, but it's amazing how right he was, how much he was able to encapsulate what the problems then were, and how much those problems are like the problems that we have now. I think that's why we keep turning to him. And I think for me, it's really those essays when he's talking about the social world.
What's next for you?
Good question. I'm actually working on starting a new book project that's dedicated solely to Black gay and lesbian artists. And I'm really interested in trying to determine for myself what I think they're up to, how to describe their work. And this new project is a bit more diasporic, so I'm looking at African American, Caribbean, and some African writers. But I'm particularly interested in how they think about notions of public space. In part because the public space is the space of vulnerability. Like that's the space that for many, particularly Black queer artists, I mean, for Black artists and for queer artists and those who sit at the intersection of those, it's precisely when you're in the public that you often face the most danger. So I'm interested in how they think about notions of the public. So we'll see. But it's still very, very much still interested in the world, what artists are doing and how to figure out how to talk about Black, queer, marginalist artists.
We've been joined today by Professor GerShun Avilez, who is Associate Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's the author of the new book, Radical Aesthetics and Modern Black Nationalism, published by the University of Illinois Press. Shout out to Lauren, who I know was your editor, and does great work. The book was published as part of the New Black Studies series and it is edited by Dame Darlene Clark-Hine and Dwight McBride. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every Black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All Black everything Black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.